Talks are expected soon between European powers and Iran on its nuclear program. Days later, the man who tore up the last agreement, Donald Trump, will return to the White House. So where do things stand, and what does each side want? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. Iran says it will hold talks with the UK, Germany and France in Geneva next week to discuss its nuclear programme. An international deal 10 years ago limiting Iran's nuclear capability in exchange for reduced sanctions was scrapped by Donald Trump. He returns as US president this month. But while strongly hostile to Iran, he said there must be another deal. Israeli attacks, the weakening of key allies and the collapse of the Assad regime have shaken Tehran in the past year. So, what is each side looking for? And could Iran pursue a more hardline stance, or is a deal really possible? We'll hear from our guests shortly, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
It's been nearly a decade since world powers signed a landmark nuclear deal with Iran. Under the seven-nation accord, Tehran agreed to scale back its nuclear program, and Western nations agreed to lift financial, trade and oil sanctions that had isolated and crippled Iran's economy. But Donald Trump pulled the United States out of that agreement in 2018. He said Iran was a threat in the Middle East and a new plan was needed. He reimposed sanctions that squeezed Iran's economy. Tehran in turn suspended some of its commitments in the nuclear deal and increased uranium enrichment. European powers have been battling to save the 2015 deal ever since. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, met top Iranian officials in Tehran in November, including President Masoud Pezeshkian. He's expressed his willingness to renegotiate the 2015 nuclear deal. The IAEA says Iran has enriched uranium up to 60%. 90% is needed to reach weapons-grade level.
The Islamic Republic of Iran is ready for nuclear negotiations and cooperation within the framework of previous agreements. It depends on how serious the opposite parties are in this matter. Iran made the nuclear agreement and implemented it with goodwill. It was the other parties who withdrew.
The region's political landscape has changed dramatically since the last deal was agreed. Iran and its proxies, including Hezbollah and Hamas, have been weakened by Israel in the past year. Israel also attacked Iran. It responded with missile strikes. While Trump pulled out of the deal painstakingly forged a decade ago, the Biden administration has not reinstated it. As European powers and Iran consider what to do next, they're doing so with the uncertainty of what policies the incoming Trump presidency will pursue. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
And let's bring in our guest. Hassan Ahmadian is a professor at the University of Tehran. He joins us from the Iranian capital. Ellie, Geranmayeh is the Deputy Director of Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He joins us from London. And Trita Parsi is the Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute. He joins us from Washington, D.C. A warm welcome to all of you. Let's start in Tehran with Hassan. Hassan, why is this being done now? Why is the European powers, France, UK, Germany, reaching out to Iran and vice versa at this particular point?
Well, there hasn't been really much in terms of the JCPOA or developments related to it. What is coming in is the President Trump back to power in Washington, and also another basically the snapback mechanism that was embedded in the deal is to come up in October. So these two issues have the potential to escalate things between Iran and the Europeans and the United States. The Iranians, of course, are trying to stop this kind of de-escalation, reaching a consensus or reconciliation with the Europeans. though there are other issues that are affecting the relationship with Europe, in particular the Ukrainian issue and the Palestinian issue. But I think these two matters are the new things that are to be added to the file that has been basically stopped by the United States back in 2018. Now they are trying to stop. I think on the Iranian part, as you heard from Iranian officials, they are trying to basically stop any escalation, which is a hard thing considering the rhetoric emanating from Washington and also the hardline position the European parties are now speaking with regards to Iran.
Let's bring in Trita Parsi at this point. Trita, you have written a book on the genesis of Iran's actual deal with the US. You followed it very closely. The question that most people have is very simple. There was a deal on the table. Iran did stick to the deal, and then the deal was taken off by Donald Trump. So why not just go back to the deal that we had before?
Well, this is exactly what the Biden administration should have done, and it didn't. Instead of going back into the deal right away through an executive order, it decided to use Trump's sanctions as leverage in order to see if it could get a better deal. And instead, it got nothing. And as a result, you now have a situation in which the JCPOA, for all practical purposes, is dead. Snapback, as Professor Ahmadian pointed out, may be exercised by the Europeans in the next couple of months, which then most likely will trigger an Iranian exit from the NPT altogether, and we will see a complete disaster on this file. Had Biden gone back in, not only would we have avoided this, but most likely the Iranians would also not be supporting the Russians in Ukraine in the manner that they currently are doing. So this is a cascade of events that have taken place, started off, of course, with Trump pulling out, but really getting aggravated by the Biden administration choosing not to go back into the deal.
Let's bring in Ellie here. Ellie, just what's the European strategy here? Why are France, Germany and the UK doing this now?
Well, I think a big part of it is that in preparation for the big uncertainties surrounding the incoming Trump administrations, the Europeans want to ensure that they are still in the game of diplomacy and policymaking, international policymaking on Iran. There is a concern, again, given the unknowns around President Trump, that he may pull a North Korea with Iran and that the Europeans will be sidelined. So I think one factor is that the Europeans want to ensure that after 20 years of sort of shepherding this nuclear diplomacy with Tehran, that they stay in the game, because in particular, countries like France have huge stake in the system, the international system surrounding nuclear proliferation, and they want to ensure that some of the inspections and monitorings and rollback of Iranian nuclear activities happen if there is nuclear negotiations. Secondly, as Professor Ahmadian pointed out, the issue of snapback is really the last remaining tool and leverage that Europeans have at the moment vis-a-vis Tehran. And these meetings are sort of a reminder from the European side to Tehran that there is this sword hanging over Tehran's head, per se, that if Iran aggravates too far, escalates too far on nuclear activities, that the Europeans will be forced to trigger snapback earlier than they may have to. Again, the timeline is coming up in October when a critical decision has to be made. And also that leverage can be used to push and press Tehran into nuclear diplomacy with the United States on terms that it may not necessarily want from the Iranian side, but feel more compelled to, given what's happened on the regional landscape in recent months. But I should just add that I think from Iran's side, there is also an interest to ensure that they sort of peel off the E3, the so-called E3 countries that are parties to nuclear diplomacy with Tehran, from a potential maximum pressure campaign from President Trump in his second term. So there's an interest from both sides to continue this diplomatic tango going forward until the chips fall and we understand exactly where US policy goes on Iran.
Well, let's bring in Hassan here. Hassan, is this the Iranians peeling off as Ellie just said, nuclear diplomacy, get a framework done right now that then President Donald Trump has to follow. He'll be boxed in by it. Is that a strategy?
I think the two parties are talking to one another with one eye on the White House to see what are the options that are on the table come January 20th. For the Europeans, as Ellie has mentioned, I think they have a stake there. They want to stay in the game. And I think the Iranians understand that and welcome that, provided that these parties are not going to be more Catholic than the Pope, putting more pressure on Tehran than it is already under by snapping back the sanctions, the UN sanctions. Now, in terms of the Iranian priorities, of course, they don't want escalation, but their ideal outcome is a reconciliation, maybe in the short window of opportunity that I think it is going to open with the new administration in Washington, a reconciliation that can basically reinstate a sort of a deal that can resemble the JCPOA, not exactly the JCPOA, but at the same time would lower the sanctions that were imposed unilaterally by the United States on Iran. Now, the snapback mechanism will do the opposite by basically internationalizing the sanctions that are unilateral now. It will give it more legal frame, international legal frame. Of course, that's a concern that Tehran has, and I think it's part of the rationale why the Iranians are now talking to the Europeans, considering really the harsh rhetoric we hear from European capitals.
Trita, one of the things that Donald Trump said, one of the reasons for pulling out the deal, is he said that Iran didn't stick to the spirit of the deal, that they were still supporting what's now called the axis of resistance, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, etc. So that's likely, it's a clue, isn't it, that likely that is going to be part of any new deal. Do you think that's correct?
I think it is quite likely that the next deal, if there is one, will contain other elements, and regional aspects are obviously going to be quite important, but whether they will be central to it, whether they will be key variables to it, remains to be seen. I think actually the main concern that Trump has is not the regional aspect, but rather why did the original JCPOA not allow American companies to go into the Iranian market? It allowed Chinese, Russian, European companies to go in, but not the American ones, because the Obama administration did not put primary sanctions, meaning the sanctions that the U.S. imposes on its own companies, on the table. I think Trump's key interest here is to make sure that if any deal is struck, that he can say he got a better deal because it will benefit the American economy and the American businesses. And there is an opportunity there, because the Iranians are now realizing, I think, that there will not be any sustainable American sanctions relief unless there is actually American companies in Iran, meaning that European companies who go into Iran will leave on the minute if the U.S. reimposes sanctions. But if American companies are in Iran, it will be much more difficult for the U.S. to ever go back to a sanctions policy. So if you actually want to have sustainable sanctions relief, you need to welcome in the Americans into the Iranian economy. So I think there's an opportunity there, since this is a key Trump interest. The Iranians seem to be realizing this. The question is if the mechanics and the movements of diplomacy actually enable the two parties to even get to the stage of discussing these core issues.
Ellie, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because you've heard Trita Parsi there talk about the idea that when Donald Trump is a business president, he wants American interests put first. That might not chime very well with the Europeans, though. I mean, that's going to be a sticking point when it comes to getting everybody together, surely.
Well, look, I think that for better or for worse, we are in a situation where there are so many tense points between Europe and Iran. The nuclear file is obviously one of them, but you have Iran's support to Russia, as the Europeans see it, in the war in Ukraine. You have bilateral issues over Western detainees unjustly held in Iran. So we are in an environment where even if there is a nuclear deal, that the Europeans are part of it, I don't foresee that there's going to be a rush of European businesses to Tehran, of European diplomats going to Iran, in the same way that we saw with the opening following the 2015 nuclear deal. I think what we are entering into is a much more direct negotiation than we've had before between the US and Iran, if indeed, as Mr. Parsi said, there is going to be diplomacy. But that actually this time round, in an ironic way, it's going to be the Arab actors, Iran's neighbors, that are going to take Europe's traditional role in both diplomatic outreach with Tehran, but also the economic outreach with Iran. I think there's this understanding that there's going to be a triangulation of economic benefits that Iran would derive from a future deal that would first and foremost come from countries like, for example, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. And in this way, there is a path forward where the West actually does the nuclear diplomacy with Tehran, and the Arab Gulf states around Iran do some of the regional security discussions with Iran. But the economic benefits that derive from US sanctions lifting come from some of Iran's neighbors first and foremost, in ways that traditionally we had seen come from Europe. So I think the game is a very different one than what we saw in 2015.
Hassan, the game is a very different one from what we saw before. If Iran is asked to give up the support for the axis of resistance, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., as we mentioned before, if it's asked to temper its regional influence, is that going to fly with Iran? Is that going to be something they are willing to negotiate on? What are the red lines here?
I think the Iranians were clear back in 2015 that they will move towards regional agreement with the West, provided that the nuclear deal would stick and that it would work for the Iranians economically. I think the Iranian experience is quite the opposite. That did not materialize. Now, I don't see any Iranian objection to deal on a bigger, basically deal with the West on a bigger platform. Actually, it was Iran that firstly proposed the grand bargain back in 2004. But did not receive any answer from the United States. That included regional aspects, of course. Now, with regards to Trump, I think, no matter what the excuse was, one of the biggest deals that has been signed by Iran the past 4 decades was with Boeing. So the Iranians understood that they need to get engaged get the American companies engaged in Iran, have their interests also in entering the Iranian market. But that did not really stop Trump. Actually, Trump wants a deal for himself. He didn't like the first deal because it was Obama's. He wanted a new one, and the Iranians were okay. But the way he pulled the United States out of the deal against its basically the legality of the deal did not appeal to the Iranians. So they couldn't really.
Well, actually, that's a very good point. Let me pick that up with Trita. Trita, trust is the coin of diplomacy. It's the bedrock of diplomacy. There was a deal. Trump ripped it all up. Why should the Iranians trust any new deal coming from Trump, even if it's a business-based one, as you might suggest could happen? Why do they trust them?
So trust obviously is important, but trust is not something that you just get on the spot. Trust is something that is built up actually through agreements over the course of a very long time. What you need to have in place is mechanisms that help you build trust. And there are plenty of good reasons for the Iranians not to trust Trump, not to trust the United States, and vice versa. The question is, do their interests align? Do they have an interest in trying to see if an arrangement can be put in place? I think Trump has an interest. He wants to get out of the Middle East. He wants to reduce the risk of the U.S. getting dragged into wars over there. He wants to be able to say, as Professor Ahmadian said, that he did a better deal, that this is good for him. This is about his ego. If you take a look around, there's probably 3 major deals that can be struck by Trump within the first year. One is between Russia and Ukraine. One is between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And one is between the US and Iran. Between the 3, despite the fact that they're all very difficult, it seems to me that Iran may actually be the lowest hanging fruit for many different reasons, including that the US is the main actor in that deal making, whereas it is not necessarily in the other ones. And as a result, it may very well end up being that Trump prioritizes this issue, perhaps not immediately, but after realizing how difficult the others are. And then the question is, does that align with Iranian interests? And if it does so, they will have to take a chance, both of them. And then if it works out, then perhaps some trust will be built. If not, further trust depletion will take place. But if you make trust a precondition for a deal, you will not get a deal under almost any circumstance.
Ellie, it's an interesting point that Trita makes in Washington, D.C. He's talking about the Americans and their push for diplomacy, this idea it's a low-hanging fruit, so it's a deal that can get done. But there is an elephant in the room here as well, and that is Israel. Israel has a say in American foreign policy, like it or not. That's actually just a fact. So Israel is going to get involved in this as well. And as we've seen from Israel, there's a hard line when it comes to any deal to be made. Now, where are the Europeans along with all of this, and where is America with this idea that Israel is going to have a say?
Well, look, I think that keeping Israel closely engaged in the discussions that happen with Iran is something that Europeans and the US administration, even under Biden, has understood as a necessity to prevent them from acting as a spoiler. So I think going forward, there's going to have to be sort of management of relations from both Tehran and the United States, actually. So on the US side, we have a president, incoming President Trump, that may actually, unlike any other president in recent time, be able to let's say, strong-arm Israel into accepting a deal between the US and Iran. I don't think that the Netanyahu administration will be willing to put up a similar type of fight that we saw them put up under Obama against a Trump administration. And remember that there's going to be a whole series of trade-offs that will be happening between the US and Israel on issues like what's happening in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria. So we are, again, as I mentioned, in a very different game today than we are in 2015. So that needs to be understood. But again, President Trump is going to be a president who will not like to be told what to do by an Israeli administration, and is likely to push back. Also, we're going to have quite a strong hold of Republicans in the US Congress. And the last time a deal was agreed between the US and Iran under President Obama, there was a lot of work to be done in the US Congress because they were also being essentially cornered by Israeli interests at that time. But I think now, given that loyalty to President Trump is the #1 priority for Republicans, if there is a deal being pushed forward by President Trump, you're likely to get less pushback from the Republican side and also less pushback from the Democrats that are interested in avoiding a major conflict with Iran. And on the Iranian side, there will have to be relationship management with Russia. I don't see...
Sorry, Ellie, we are running out of time, and I do want to you've made some very interesting points there, and I want to put one of them to Hassan. Hassan, the idea of the negotiation teams right now is a very different time, as all our guests have said, including you, than it was when the initial agreement was made. Is Iran going to push a hardline agenda, have a much tougher negotiating stance this time around, knowing that the stakes might be a lot higher?
Actually, Iran has never put a very hard line, policy when it comes to negotiations with the West after the JCPOA. Their pro-engagement, reform-minded new President Pezeshkian, is very much into dealing on a pragmatic basis, and I think that's what will dictate Iran's position moving forward. I don't think the Iranians are interested in any hardline position. They haven't been. They only stick to their, basically they were saying that the JCPOA is the basis for any re-engagement. Now I think it will be the basis for any re-engagement. And we have an administration that is inclined to dealing based on it, but also with pragmatism. So no, there is no hardline position. But at the same time, I mean, one hand cannot clap. There is another side, that is the United States. Iranians are eyeing Washington to see what stance and what policy it will choose, what direction it will choose. Is it a maximum pressure, revert back to enforcement, as they call it, or they want to get to a real serious reconciliation with Iran? Now, all other issues weigh in here, including Israel, Ukraine, others. I think it's very complicated, but provided that there's a will, there's a way.
Well, let's put that to Trita. Trita, is this a cause for optimism? Is a deal there to be done? I know you called it low-hanging fruit earlier, but having listened to our guest, do you think there's an easy deal, or is this going to be years in the making?
No, I don't think it's easy at all. And I want to emphasize, I said, a relative low-hanging fruit compared to the others. It's going to be very, very complicated. I do think, however, that some sort of a framework or roadmap agreement can be agreed upon on a relatively short basis. And from there on, see whether it can be filled out with all of the different details that are necessary in order for there to be a final agreement. And such a roadmap or framework agreement, and in and of itself, can be tremendously valuable because it can essentially stop the escalation that is taking place. It can have a de-escalatory effect in and of itself to just reach a framework agreement in short order. Given the fact that the region is on the verge of explosion, given what the Israelis are doing in Lebanon, in Gaza, increasingly in Syria as well, the firing from the Houthis to Israel, the risk of a larger war, having that type of a framework agreement that kind of puts a lid on the escalation is in and of itself tremendously valuable. And that, I think, can be achieved in relative short order.
Well, all eyes on January 20th then, and the inauguration of the new US president. I want to thank all our guests, Hassan Ahmadian, Ellie, Geranmayeh and Trita Parsi, and thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.